In today's video, we're examining the brutal origins and lasting impact of slavery in colonial America. From the early days of the Atlantic slave trade to the development of plantation economies and the powerful acts of resistance by enslaved people, we'll explore how slavery became deeply embedded in the fabric of colonial life and what that meant for millions of people across generations. Let's get started. The roots of slavery in the Americas stretch back to 1440 when the Portuguese began forcibly transporting Africans across the Atlantic via the Middle Passage. This transatlantic route was a horrific journey with enslaved Africans packed tightly in ships under brutal conditions. Over the course of this system's existence, around 12 million Africans were transported to the Americas. Tragically, 15% died during the voyage. In the British colonies, agriculture quickly became central to colonial life, particularly in areas with fertile land like Virginia and Maryland. As farming economies grew, so did the demand for labor. At first, this demand was met through indentured servitude, but as the colonies expanded, enslaved African laborers began to replace indentured servants as the primary workforce. It's important to note that while slavery was most concentrated in the southern colonies, it was by no means confined there. In fact, every British colony used enslaved labor to some degree. Surprisingly to some, the transatlantic slave trade was heavily financed and facilitated by individuals and businesses in the northern colonies, especially through their bustling port cities. In the early 1600s, colonies like Maryland and Virginia faced labor shortages. To address this, plantation owners turned to indentured servants, individuals who had agreed to work for a period of 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to America, along with room and board. After serving their time, they were promised freedom. Unfortunately, due to the harsh conditions, many never lived to see that freedom. At the same time, the Virginia Company promoted immigration by offering land through the headright system. Under this program, 50 acres of land were granted to immigrants who paid their own way, or to any landowner who paid for someone else's passage. Though initially effective, indentured servitude had its limits. As fewer workers were willing to risk the voyage, the colonies began to lean more heavily on enslaved African labor. The arrival of the first 20 Africans in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 marked a turning point. These individuals, likely from the kingdom of Ndongo in modern day Angola, may have initially been treated as indentured servants. But by the 1660s, things had changed. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed a series of slave codes, laws that transformed African servitude into permanent hereditary slavery. These codes made clear that slavery would now be race based, ensuring that Africans and their descendants would be enslaved for life. As demand for labor continued and indentured servants grew scarce, every British colony, from New England to the South, participated in the Atlantic slave trade. Even though small New England farms used far fewer enslaved workers, port cities in both the North and Middle colonies employed enslaved labor in tasks like loading ships. Still, the highest concentration of enslaved labor was in the Chesapeake and Southern colonies, where large plantations needed intensive labor. By 1750, enslaved individuals made up half of Virginia's population and a staggering two-thirds of South Carolina's. However, it's worth noting that the majority of enslaved Africans brought through the British transatlantic trade were not sent to the mainland colonies, but rather to the British West Indies, where they labored under extreme conditions on sugar plantations. Several key factors solidified slavery as a long term institution in colonial America. First, there was reduced migration. As wages increased in England, fewer people were willing to risk the harsh life of an indentured servant in the colonies. Second, economic logic played a role. While indentured servants only worked for a few years, enslaved Africans could be exploited for their entire lives, and their children too. Over time, this made enslaved laborers more cost effective for plantation owners. And finally, there was the political dimension. After Bacon's rebellion in 1676, an uprising that revealed the volatility of relying on poor whites and indentured servants, colonial governments responded with slave codes. These laws sought to prevent future alliances between poor whites and blacks by defining slavery strictly by race. These codes not only prohibited interracial relationships, but also decreed that children of enslaved women would themselves be enslaved, creating a self producing labor force and an entrenched racial caste system. Despite the brutal nature of slavery, enslaved Africans did not suffer in silence. Across the colonies, they found ways both subtle and bold to resist their dehumanization and maintain their identities. Overt acts of resistance included hunger strikes, damaging tools or machinery, and just flat out refusing to work. Many also attempted to escape, with estimates suggesting that 100,000 enslaved people fled captivity before the American Civil War. Just as powerful was the act of cultural survival. Through songs, oral storytelling, and religious practices, African Americans preserved their traditions. With families often separated by cell or distance, community bonds became vital. These communities helped give meaning and hope to those enduring unimaginable hardship. There were also armed rebellions, about 250 in total before the Civil War. One of the most significant was the Stono Rebellion of 1739 in South Carolina, during which 25 colonists were killed. Though ultimately crushed, such uprisings sent a powerful message that the enslaved would fight for their freedom. The story of slavery in colonial America is one of cruelty and exploitation, but also of survival, resilience, and resistance. It shaped the development of the colonies, their economies, and their social structures in profound ways. And its legacy continues to affect American life today. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.